The West doesn't care who you are or where you came from. It only cares what you're willing to do to survive. When a stagecoach arrived too fast and left too quickly, it brought trouble to Tom Wheeler's doorstep. A woman drenched in blood and silence. She had already done something she could never take back. And out here, that kind of truth always comes with consequences. Stay with this story, because survival in the West isn't about being good. It's about what you're willing to live with.
There are moments in a man's life when the world stops asking what he wants. It just sits back and watches what he'll do. For Thomas Wheeler, that moment came on a Tuesday afternoon. October 1881. Tom was out mending the western fence line. The wind was biting, cold. He heard the stagecoach before he saw it. The wheels were grinding too fast for the rough trail. It veered off the main road, stopped dead at the edge of his property. The driver didn't step down, didn't even touch his brake lever for long. The cab door swung open. A woman stepped out, alone. No luggage, just a small canvas bag. And the dress. It was a wedding dress, white cotton, but heavy at the hem. Dark, rust-colored stains climbed up the skirts and soaked the sleeves. Dried blood, a lot of it. The stagecoach bolted, left her in the dust. She started walking toward Tom. He met her halfway down the trail. His right hand rested on his belt, hovering an inch from his colt. He looked her over. No bruises on her face. Hair wasn't ripped out. She wasn't limping. But the blood, it was everywhere. He asked the only question a man could. "Ma'am, is that your blood?" She looked down at the ruined white fabric. Then she looked up, met his eyes, cold, steady. "It's not mine." She took a slow breath. "Yet." Tom let his hand drop from his gun. "You need a doctor?" "No." "You got somebody chasing you?" "I don't know," she said. "My name is Sarah Whitcomb. I was supposed to marry a man in Silver Creek. 3 days' ride from here. I never made it." Tom didn't want company. He lived alone for a reason, but the sun was dropping. Wyoming nights in October don't forgive, and there wasn't another roof for 15 miles. He opened his door. He stoked the fire, put the coffee on to boil. He dug an old, clean flannel shirt out of a trunk and handed it to her. It hung off her shoulders, but it was warm. He turned his back to the stove while she changed. When he turned around, the bloody dress was folded on a wooden chair. Tom stared at it like it was a sleeping rattlesnake. He poured 2 mugs of black coffee, set one in front of her. "You want to tell me what happened?" She wrapped her hands around the hot tin. "There were 4 of us on the stage. A preacher, his wife, a salesman, and me. Up near Elk Creek Pass, 3 men stopped us, outlaws. The salesman had a pistol, pulled it when he shouldn't have. He shot one of them. The other 2, they shot everyone else. But me." Tom stayed quiet. Let her talk. "One of them said a woman in a wedding dress would fetch a high price in Deadwood. So they kept me." She looked into the fire. Her voice didn't shake. "They tied my hands, put me on a horse, rode for hours. When the sun went down, they made camp. The younger one, he came over to me. He had a hunting knife. Told me he was going to cut the dress off me. He set the knife down on a rock so he could use both hands." She stopped. Tom saw her fingers trembling against the tin mug, not from fear, from holding it all back. "I picked the knife up." The fire cracked. "I don't remember the exact mechanics of it," she whispered. "I just remember his older brother running when he saw what I did. I remember walking, finding the road. A different stagecoach came by. Driver was from Ohio. Didn't ask questions, just brought me here." Tom looked at her, really looked at her. "The blood on the dress," Tom said. "Is it the boy's or yours from fighting him?" Sarah looked him dead in the eye. "Both." Tom stood up, walked over to the wood box, tossed another log into the flames. He didn't look at her when he spoke. He spoke to the room. "You'll sleep by the hearth tonight. Tomorrow we figure out what comes next." She didn't say thank you. She just nodded. Outside, the Wyoming wind hammered against the glass. And out there, somewhere in the dark, an older brother was bearing a boy, and looking for a bride. She didn't sleep. Tom knew it. He heard her breathing all night. It wasn't the ragged breath of a woman crying. It was the steady mechanical rhythm of someone keeping watch. When the first gray light cracked over the Wyoming ridges, Tom pushed himself off his cot. She was already at the stove. She had found the coffee, found the grinder, found the cast-iron pot. She stood there in his oversized flannel shirt, watching the water boil. "You didn't sleep," Tom said. His voice was rough with mourning. "I tried," she said. She didn't look away from the stove. My mind wouldn't stop counting. Tom pulled his suspenders up over his shoulders. Counting what? Years. Days. I was trying to figure out how old he was. The boy with the knife. She poured the dark, biting coffee into 2 tin cups. "I don't think he was older than 19. Tom didn't walk over and pat her shoulder. He didn't tell her it was going to be all right. You don't tell a woman who just killed a man that things are going to be all right. He took the cup from her hand. "Drink," he said. That was it. That was the extent of his comfort. But out here, sometimes a hot cup of coffee and a shared silence did more work than a preacher's sermon. If this story moved you, take a moment to like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to follow more journeys like this. Because sometimes, the strongest hearts are forged where the world is at its most unforgiving. Tom left the cabin after sunrise. The cattle needed tending. The fences didn't fix themselves. He told her to stay inside. Keep the fire going. Keep the door barred. Sarah was alone. The silence of a frontier cabin is heavy. It presses against your ears. Sarah couldn't just sit. If she sat, she'd see the boy's face again. So she found a broom, found a rag. She started to clean. It was a small cabin, single room mostly, a loft up top. But as she swept the corners, she started to see the edges of a life that didn't belong to Tom. There was a peg near the back door. Hanging from it was a blue cotton dress, faded, small at the waist, smaller than her own. Next to the door, tucked away like they were waiting for someone to step into them, sat a pair of shoes. Leather, scuffed at the toes. They were child's shoes. A little girl's, covered in 3 years of dust. On a wooden shelf above the wash basin lay a hairbrush. A few strands of pale blonde hair were still caught in the bristles. And next to the brush, a framed tin-type photograph, placed face down. Sarah stopped sweeping. She walked over to the shelf. She looked at the photograph lying flush against the wood. She didn't touch it. She didn't turn it over to see the faces. She took her rag, carefully wiped the dust from the shelf around it, and left it exactly as it was. She swept the floorboards. Near the hearth, she found one board that was loose. It shifted under her boot. She knelt down, lifted the wood just a fraction. Beneath it, sitting in the dark, was a small wooden box. Sarah stared at it, a secret kept in the dirt. She lowered the floorboard, tapped it back into place. She wiped down the table, scrubbed the iron skillet. But she didn't move the blue dress. She didn't touch the little shoes. She treated the cabin like a graveyard, with absolute, breathless respect. Tom came back when the sun was high. His boots were thick with mud. He kicked them off on the porch and walked in. He stopped in the center of the room. It smelled like lye soap and wood smoke. The floor was spotless. The table was scrubbed raw. He looked at the back door. The blue dress was still there. He looked at the shelf. The tintype was still face down. The dust was gone, but the ghosts hadn't been disturbed. He looked at Sarah. She was sitting by the window, mending a tear in one of his old work shirts with a needle she'd found. Tom walked over to the shelf. He reached out, picked up the tintype. He hadn't looked at it in 3 years. 3 long, brutal winters. He turned it over. The faces of a man and a woman stared back. The man was him, younger, eyes full of something that looked a lot like hope. The woman was beautiful, with a soft, steady smile. Tom set the picture back down on the shelf, this time face up. Sarah stopped sewing. She looked at him. "You don't have to do that, not because of me." "I'm not doing it because of you," Tom said. His voice was low. "I'm doing it because I walked past it for 3 years pretending it wasn't there. That's no way to remember someone." He walked over to the table, sat down heavily. The chair groaned under him. "Her name was Caroline," he said. He didn't look at Sarah. He looked at his own calloused hands. "Our daughter was Mary. She would have turned 6 this past spring." Sarah didn't move. She barely breathed. "Cholera came through the county. Summer of '78. It was fast, ugly. I buried them both within 4 days of each other." Tom rubbed his thumb across his knuckles. "I dug the holes myself. The ground was baked hard that August. Took me 2 days to dig deep enough. No one else would come out here to do it. They were too scared of the sickness. So it was just me." He finally looked up, met her eyes. "I haven't said their names out loud in 2 years." Sarah sat with that. She felt the weight of it. He was handing her a piece of his grief. A man like Tom Wheeler didn't do that unless he decided you were worth it. It meant she owed him her own truth in return, not just the facts of what happened. The truth. She set the needle down. "I killed a boy 2 nights ago," Sarah said. Her voice didn't waver. "I drove a knife into him until he stopped moving." Tom just watched her. "I'm not sorry he's dead," she said. The words tasted like iron in her mouth. "I know I should be. I know a good Christian woman would weep for his soul, but I'm not sorry. I'm glad he's dead and I'm alive. I think that's the part that's going to haunt me, not the killing. The absolute lack of regret." The cabin was dead quiet. Just the wind pushing against the log walls. Tom leaned back in his chair. He looked at the picture on the shelf. Then he looked back at the woman sitting across from him. A woman wearing his shirt, running from her life, carrying a darkness she refused to lie about. "Caroline would have liked you," Tom said. He stood up, walked out the back door to wash his hands, leaving Sarah alone in the quiet for the first time, feeling like maybe she wasn't a monster after all. 4 days passed. The coffee ran out. The flour was down to a handful of dust at the bottom of the barrel. Tom stood by the open pantry. "We need to go to town." Sarah was standing by the stove. She stiffened. "I can't go to town. Somebody will ask questions." "They'll ask more questions if I leave you out here alone and someone comes snooping," Tom said. He turned to her. "We need a story. We need to decide what we're going to tell people before we get there, not after." Sarah wiped her hands on an apron. "Tell them what you need to tell them. I'll follow your lead." Tom nodded. "You're my cousin. From Ohio. Sarah Wheeler. Your husband died of typhus last month. You had no family left. I sent for you to help keep the house. That's the story. You stick to it. Don't blink." "Ohio," she repeated. "All right. And if someone asks about my clothes, if they ask why I showed up with nothing?" Tom looked away. He walked over to the back door, reached up, took the faded blue dress off the peg. He held it in his hands for a long moment. Then he turned and held it out to her. "They won't ask," Tom said, "because you're going to wear this." Sarah looked at the dress, then at him. She knew what this cost him. He was taking the armor off his grief and wrapping it around her to keep her safe. She took the fabric. It felt soft, worn. "Thank you," she whispered. "Just make it fit," he said, and walked out to hitch the wagon. Red Fork wasn't much of a town. A single dirt street carved out of the prairie. A church, a bank, a general store with a post office attached, a sheriff's office that usually sat empty. It serviced about 200 people scattered across 20 miles of unforgiving territory. They arrived on Sunday morning. By design. Tom parked the wagon across from the church just as the heavy wooden doors swung open. People poured out into the crisp autumn air. Tom wanted this done in one fell swoop. Introduce her once to the whole congregation, let the gossip burn fast, and be done with it. He helped Sarah down from the wagon. The blue dress fit her well enough, a little loose in the shoulders, but it looked right. She took a breath, squared her posture, and walked beside him. The talking stopped. Heads turned, eyes locked onto them. Tom Wheeler hadn't brought a woman to town since his wife was put in the ground. Reverend Josiah Bell was the first to approach. He was a tall man, pushing 70, with a thick beard and eyes that missed nothing. He had marched in the Mexican-American War before he ever picked up a Bible. He shook Tom's hand, then turned his sharp gaze on Sarah. "Welcome to Red Fork," Bell said. "I don't believe we've had the pleasure." "My cousin," Tom said, his voice flat, smooth. "Sarah Wheeler from Ohio. She's going to be keeping house for me." Bell held Sarah's eyes for a second too long. He saw the tension in her jaw. He saw the way she carried herself, not like a grieving widow, but like a soldier waiting for a shot to ring out. "Welcome, Mrs. Wheeler," Bell said smoothly. He accepted the lie, but his eyes told her he knew it was one. Before Sarah could reply, a stout woman pushed past the Reverend. Mrs. Henrietta Crow. She ran the general store and the town's rumor mill. "Ohio, you say?" Mrs. Crow beamed, her eyes darting over Sarah's dress. "Where exactly?" "My sister married a man from Toledo." "Columbus," Sarah said without missing a beat. It wasn't entirely a lie. She had an aunt in Columbus. "It's a long journey, Mrs. Crow. I'm just grateful to be off the trail." "I imagine," Mrs. Crow chirped. A young girl stepped up next, 17, maybe 18, dark hair, warm brown eyes, and a genuine smile. Emma Reyes. Her father was Mexican-American, her mother white. They ran a tailoring business out of their cabin. "It's nice to meet you, ma'am," Emma said. "If you ever need anything mended or altered, my mother and I do good work." "Thank you, Emma," Sarah said. And she meant it. It was the first smile she'd seen today that didn't feel like an interrogation. Then the crowd parted. Silas Marsh stepped through. He wore a tailored black suit that cost more than most men in Red Fork made in a year. He was the town banker, slick hair, a smile that showed teeth but never reached his eyes. He stopped in front of Tom. "Wheeler," Silas said. "I didn't know you had family coming. That's quite a change for you. Usually you prefer to rot out on that ranch all by your lonesome." Tom didn't rise to the bait. "Things change, Silas." Silas turned his dead-eyed smile to Sarah. He tipped his hat. "A pleasure, I'm sure. Strange time to be traveling, though." Silas looked back at Tom, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper that was loud enough for half the street to hear. "I don't know if you caught the news from the stage company, Tom. Tuesday's coach out of Laramie got hit at Elk Creek Pass, bloody mess, 4 dead, preacher, his wife, a drummer, and the driver. But the strangest thing—" Silas paused, let the hook dangle. "One passenger went missing, a woman. Rumor is she was wearing a wedding dress." Tom's face was made of stone. He didn't look at Sarah. "You haven't seen any strangers passing through your land, have you, Tom?" Silas asked. "I work my own land, Silas. If strangers pass through, they don't stop at my place." "Of course not," Silas smiled. "Well, the U.S. Marshal has been wired. He'll be coming to ask questions. There's talk of a heavy reward for information. Just thought you should know. A man with a mortgage like yours could use the cash." He tipped his hat again and walked away. Sarah's heart was hammering against her ribs, but she kept her face perfectly blank. She turned to Tom. "We have what we came for?" "We do," Tom said. "Let's go." They loaded the supplies. Sarah climbed up onto the bench. Tom took the reins. They were a mile out of town, leaving the dirt street behind, when they heard the sound of a horse approaching fast from the rear. Tom pulled the wagon to a halt. His hand went to the rifle under the seat. A lone rider pulled up alongside them. It was an older man, gray hair sticking out from under a battered hat, a face lined with deep sun damage. Jedediah Parker. He owned the land east of Tom's. He hadn't spoken a word to Tom in town. Jed didn't look at Sarah. He kept his eyes fixed on Tom. "I was in town yesterday, Tom. Saw the telegraph notice pinned outside the sheriff's office. 4 dead, 1 missing. Said the missing woman was wearing a white dress. Said she was last seen getting off a stagecoach near Red Fork." Tom tightened his grip on the reins. "Jed." I didn't ride out here to ask questions, Jed interrupted. His voice was gravel. I came to tell you that Silas Marsh read that same notice. And Silas Marsh has been trying to get his claws on your land for 2 years. If he thinks he can get it by selling information to a federal marshal and putting a rope around somebody's neck, he will. Jed spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. You've got maybe 2 weeks before Marsh connects the dots and sends a wire east to bring the law down on your head. Tom stared at his neighbor. Why are you telling me this, Jed? You don't owe me a damn thing. Jed looked at Tom. For the first time, a glimmer of old, tired emotion broke through the leather of his face. Because in July of 1863, at a place called Gettysburg, a Union corporal could have put a bullet through my spine while I was dragging my bleeding brother out of a muddy creek. He had the drop on me. But he lowered his rifle. He let me walk. Jed tipped his hat back. I never knew that Yankee's name, but I spent 18 years looking for a way to pay that debt. Today, I'm paying it. Jed wheeled his horse around. He kicked the spurs and rode off back toward town, kicking up a trail of dust. Tom watched him go. He let out a long, slow breath. Sarah sat beside him, gripping the wooden bench. You saved a Confederate soldier at Gettysburg? Tom clicked his tongue, snapping the reins to get the horses moving again. I saved a man pulling his brother out of the water, Tom said, staring down the long, empty road ahead. I didn't check the color of his uniform. He kept driving. 2 weeks. They had 2 weeks before the world came to their door to burn it down. Frost clung to the dead grass, crisp and white, the kind of morning that cracks in your lungs. Tom was up before the sun. He had made a decision in the dark, a quiet one. But out here, quiet decisions are usually the ones that keep you alive. He walked into the cabin. Sarah was already awake. She was always awake. We need to smoke the meat, Tom said. He poured water into the wash basin, splashed it on his face. Weather's going to turn soon, he told her. Winter doesn't knock out here, it just kicks the door in. I've got venison and a slaughtered hog hanging in the shed. We need to smoke it today. It's a 2-person job. You up for it? Sarah wiped down the table. Show me what to do. They walked out to the smokehouse. It sat 20 paces from the main cabin, a small, windowless wooden structure. The wood was black on the inside, stained deep from years of curing. When Tom opened the heavy door, the smell hit them. Hickory, salt, old fat. It was a rich, heavy smell, a smell that meant survival. He lit the fire in the pit, kept it low, just a smolder. The trick is the smoke, not the flame, Tom said. He hauled a quartered hog onto the heavy wooden table in the center of the room. Fire cooks it. We don't want it cooked. We want it cured. The smoke chokes out the rot, preserves it. He handed her a wooden bowl. It was heavy, filled with coarse salt, brown sugar, and cracked black pepper. You rub, he said, every inch. Don't be gentle with it. You have to work it into the grain of the meat. If you miss a spot, the rot gets in. And if the rot gets in, we starve in February. Sarah took the bowl. She didn't flinch at the blood on the meat. She dug her hands into the salt, pressed it into the cold pork. They worked side by side. For the first hour, it was just the sound of the work, the scrape of salt against meat, the hiss of the hickory wood popping in the pit. It was a good silence, a working silence. You learn a lot about a person by how they work. Sarah didn't stop to rub her back. She didn't complain about the cold seeping through her boots. She just kept pace. By mid-morning, the smoke was thick. It stung their eyes. Tom pushed the door open to let some air in. They stepped out, sat on a fallen cottonwood trunk just outside the smokehouse. Tom unstoppered his canteen, took a long drink, handed it to her. She drank, wiped her mouth with the back of her salty hand. Sarah looked at the smoke drifting up into the pale Wyoming sky. Why did you let me stay? She asked. She didn't look at him, just threw the question out into the cold air. That first night, she said, you could have taken me into town. Could have dropped me at the sheriff's office, or just closed your door and gone back to sleep. Why didn't you? Tom rested his forearms on his knees. He looked at the dirt between his boots. He took a long time to answer. He wasn't a man who wasted words. He wanted to make sure he used the right ones. When Caroline and Mary died, Tom said. His voice was gravelly, low. I stopped going to town. I stopped talking to folks. Stopped going to church. Reverend Bell used to ride out here once a month for 2 years. He'd stand on my porch and try to talk me out of my own head. Tom picked up a twig, snapped it. I never let him inside, never opened the door. I just sat in the dark until he gave up and rode away. Last fall, he finally stopped coming. Told me through the window he was going to pray for me from his pulpit instead. Said he hoped God would thaw me out. Tom looked over at her. I was numb, Sarah. For 3 years. I didn't feel the cold. I didn't feel the heat. I was just walking around breathing because my body forgot how to stop. He turned fully toward her now. When you walked up my road in that ruined dress, you didn't look sad. You didn't look scared. You looked angry. You looked like you wanted to burn the whole territory down. Tom paused. I hadn't seen anyone feel something that sharp in a long time. I hadn't felt anything that sharp. I think I let you stay because I wanted to remember what it was like. To have a living, breathing person in the house, someone who wasn't just waiting to die. Sarah held his gaze. And now? Now, Tom said. I think I'm the one who needs to remember how to live, not you. Sarah looked down at her hands. They were coated in salt and dried blood, not her blood, the pig's. But the sight of it brought the memories rushing back. She knew what this conversation was. It was a trade. He had given her a piece of his soul. She owed him a piece of hers. I wasn't a real mail-order bride, Sarah said. Her voice was steady, practiced, like a lesson she had memorized. My father was a merchant in Boston. He liked to gamble on shipping routes. He wasn't very good at it. We owed money, a lot of money, to a man named Reginald Hayes. She spat the name out like it was poison. Hayes was a prominent man, old money, powerful. I was 16 when my father first promised me to him, an arrangement to settle the debt. But Hayes didn't want to marry a teenager. He wanted to wait. Sarah looked back at the smokehouse fire. By the time I was 23, I had built my own life. I was teaching at a girls' school in the city. I had a small room, my own wages. I was independent. Then Hayes decided it was time to collect. But he didn't want to marry me anymore. I was too old for his tastes by then. He wanted something else. Tom's jaw tightened. He didn't interrupt. Hayes told my father he would forgive the debt if I agreed to be available to him. In a private house he kept in Back Bay. My father actually brought me the letter, handed it to me, asked me what I thought about it, like it was a shipping contract. Sarah let out a bitter, hollow laugh. I left that night, took whatever money I had saved. I found a newspaper clipping. A man in Silver Creek, Wyoming, looking for a wife. I wrote to him, bought a train ticket. I put the wedding dress on before I got on the stagecoach in Laramie. I wanted the last thing Boston saw of me to be a bride, not a piece of property. Tom stared at her. Did you love him? The man in Silver Creek? I never even met him, Sarah said. He might have been a good man. He might have been a monster. It didn't matter. I wasn't running toward him. I was running away. She wiped her hands on her apron. I didn't come out here to find a husband. I came out here to survive. And then the stagecoach got stopped. And I had to survive all over again. Tom stood up. He walked over to the smokehouse door. He didn't go in. He just stood there, looking out over the plains. Sarah, he said. He didn't turn around. Whatever happens in the next 2 weeks with Silas Marsh, with the U.S. Marshal, I want you to know something right now. He turned, looked at her. His eyes were fierce, unyielding. If the Marshal comes riding up that road, I will tell him the truth. I will tell him you defended yourself from an animal who meant to sell you into hell. I will swear to it. I will stand for you. Sarah's breath caught. You barely know me. I know you, Tom said. I know you worked beside me all morning, salting meat, and didn't complain once. I know you killed a man to stay free, and you lose sleep over it because you still have a conscience. I know you haven't asked me for a single promise since you got here. He stepped closer to her. That's more character than most people show me in a lifetime. I'll stand for you." Sarah looked at this man, this rough, broken, honest man. She felt a wall inside her chest crack, just a hairline fracture. But it was enough. "My friends in Boston," she said quietly. "The other teachers. They used to call me Ellie. It's from my middle name, Ellen." She swallowed hard. "I haven't heard anyone say it out loud in 7 years." Tom watched her. He nodded just once, a slow, deliberate movement. "Time to get back to work," he said. "Ellie." He turned and walked back into the smokehouse. Sarah sat there on the log for a second longer. She closed her eyes, listened to the wind. For the first time since she left Massachusetts, she felt like she actually existed. She stood up and followed him into the smoke. The weather broke, but not the way they needed it to. It didn't snow, it didn't rain. The wind just shifted. It came down from the mountains, hot and dry, unseasonably warm for late October. It sucked the moisture right out of the dirt. The grass turned to powder under the horses' hooves. The east well went dry first, just a hollow, echoing clank when the bucket hit the bottom. Mud and stones, no water. Tom had to move the cattle. He had to drive them 3 miles south, down to a lower pasture where a creek still ran shallow over the rocks. It added 4 hours of brutal work to his day, every day. Driving them down in the morning, driving them back before the wolves came out at night. He was wearing out. Sarah saw it. She saw the way he dragged his boots when he walked in at dusk, the way his shoulders slumped over his plate of beans and salt pork. She did what she could. She kept the fire hot. She kept his clothes clean. She tended to a sick ewe in the barn so he wouldn't have to. She didn't complain. She just watched and waited. One evening, as he was falling asleep sitting up in his chair by the stove, she spoke. "You're not sleeping enough. You can't keep this pace, not for another 2 weeks." Tom rubbed his face with his calloused hands. "I don't have a choice, Ellie. The herd needs water. Without water, they die. Without the herd, the bank takes the land." "There is always a choice," she said quietly. "You just haven't seen it yet." The next morning, the choice came riding up the trail. Tom was already gone, driving the cattle south. Sarah was out on the porch, shaking out a rug, when she saw the buggy. Black leather, high wheels, pulled by a matched pair of bays. Silas Marsh. He didn't come alone. He had a clerk with him, a nervous-looking young man clutching a leather satchel. Silas pulled the horses up near the porch. He didn't step down. He just sat there looking down at Sarah with that cold, practiced smile. "Mrs. Wheeler," Silas said, tipping his expensive hat. "A pleasure to see you again. Is your cousin about?" "My cousin is working his land, Mr. Marsh," Sarah said. She held the rug in her hands. She didn't invite him inside. "Pity," Silas sighed. "I came to speak with Thomas regarding his note. The winter payment is due November 1st. I'm sure you know. Given this unfortunate drought, I thought he might want to discuss some early options." Sarah stared at him. "Options?" "Alternatives, let's call them." Silas shifted in his seat. "The bank is always willing to work with its neighbors. I came to propose a purchase. The bank is willing to buy the south parcel of this ranch, the land with the creek access, for a very fair price." Sarah's eyes narrowed. The south parcel, the only part of the land that still had water. He wasn't trying to help Tom. He was trying to cut the throat of the ranch. "If he sells," Silas continued, his voice smooth as oil, "that would clear his note entirely. He'd own the main house and the dry pastures free and clear. A very generous offer considering the circumstances." Silas snapped his fingers. The clerk scrambled to open the satchel, handed Silas a thick stack of papers. Silas held them out toward Sarah. "Perhaps you could give these to him. Have him look them over." Sarah walked forward. She took the papers. She didn't look at them. She looked right through Silas Marsh. "I will see that he gets them." Silas smiled. "You're not from the West, are you, Mrs. Wheeler?" "Ohio," Tom said. A different breed of people out there, I suppose. I do hope you're adjusting to our rough ways. I find people are the same everywhere, Mr. Marsh, Sarah said. Her voice was ice. Some are honest, some are not. The geography doesn't change the breed. Silas's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Then it returned. Indeed. Good day to you, ma'am. He whipped the horses and drove away in a cloud of dry dust. Tom came home after dark. He looked like he had been beaten with a hammer. Dust caked his face, turning his sweat into mud. He washed up at the basin, not saying a word. Sarah placed the papers on the table next to his plate. Silas Marsh came by today, she said. Tom stopped drying his face. He looked at the papers, his jaw clenched. What does he want? He wants the south parcel. He brought a purchase agreement, says it will clear your debt. Tom dropped the towel. He walked over to the table, stared at the paperwork. He looked defeated. The south parcel has the only reliable water. If I sell that, the rest of this ranch isn't worth spit. He knows it. He's choking me out. Sarah watched him. Let me see the bank note. Tom frowned. What? Your loan papers, the original promissory note, the ledgers, whatever you have. Let me see them. Ellie, it's banking nonsense. It's just numbers. I am aware of what it is, Tom. Bring them to me. It wasn't a request. It was the tone of a woman who was used to commanding a classroom. Tom blinked, surprised by the authority in her voice. He went to the heavy wooden chest at the foot of his bed, dug down to the bottom, pulled out a tin lockbox. He brought it to the table and opened it. Inside were 3 years of receipts, folded contracts, the original deed. I owe him $1,400 on November 1st, Tom said. It's the balloon payment. I don't have it. The drought killed the spring calf crop. Sarah didn't say anything. She pushed his dinner plate aside. She took the papers out of the tin box. She smoothed them flat on the rough wood. Go eat your dinner on the porch, she said. Leave me be. Tom took his plate and walked out. Sarah trimmed the wick on the oil lamp. She pulled up a chair. She found a pencil and a blank piece of paper. And she went to work. She was a schoolteacher from Boston. But before that, she was the daughter of a merchant. She had grown up reading shipping manifests. She knew numbers. Numbers didn't lie. Numbers didn't care about the drought. They didn't care about Silas Marsh's expensive suits. They followed rules. She read the original promissory note, signed in 1877. She read the receipts. She did the math. She did it again. And then she did it a third time just to be absolutely certain. 2 hours passed. The cabin was silent, except for the scratch of her pencil lead against the paper. The fire in the stove burned down to embers. The back door opened. Tom walked in. He carried his empty plate. He looked at her, surrounded by ledgers and papers. Find something? He asked. He sounded tired, defeated. Sarah set the pencil down. She looked up at him. Her eyes were burning brightly in the dim lamplight. Sit down, Tom. He sat. Sarah pushed the original contract across the table toward him. Your original agreement, she said, tapping the paper with her finger, states that Silas Marsh extended you a loan at 6% simple interest, annually. Tom nodded slowly. That's right. Sarah pushed a piece of her own scratch paper toward him. It was covered in neat, precise columns of numbers. Marsh hasn't been charging you 6% simple interest. For the past 3 years, he's been charging you 8.5%. And he hasn't been calculating it simply. He's been compounding it quarterly. Tom stared at the numbers. They blurred together in his tired eyes. What does that mean, Ellie? It means, Sarah said, her voice ringing with cold, hard triumph, that you do not owe Silas Marsh $1,400 for the winter payment. She tapped the bottom line of her calculation. You owe him $612. Tom stopped breathing. And, Sarah continued, leaning forward, if we go to Cheyenne and hire a federal lawyer to sue for restitution of the fraudulent overcharges over the last 3 years, Silas Marsh owes you $980. The cabin was dead silent. Tom stared at her. You're sure? I taught arithmetic to girls whose families thought they only needed to know how to play the piano, Sarah said fiercely. I checked the math 4 times. He is robbing you on paper. Tom sat back in his chair. He looked at the papers. Then he looked at her. Really looked at her. "How did you see this?" he whispered. "I've looked at those papers a dozen times. How did you see it and I didn't?" "Because you trust people," Sarah said softly. "You assume people are operating with honor. I stopped trusting people a long time ago." Tom shook his head. A slow, disbelieving laugh escaped his chest. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. It was a good sound. He reached across the table. He didn't grab her hand. He just laid his rough, calloused fingers gently over hers. "You could have taken these papers," Tom said quietly, "when I wasn't home. You could have written to the U.S. Marshal, told him I was threatening you, got the reward money. You could have been on a train back east by tomorrow morning. Safe." Sarah looked down at his hand resting on hers. "Yes, I could have." "Why didn't you?" Sarah looked up. She met his eyes. They were honest eyes. "Because," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "you gave me back my name. I don't know what else to call that, but it's not something you betray." Tom didn't move his hand. He just nodded in the lamplight. The drought was still outside. Silas Marsh was still in town. The marshal was still coming. But sitting there at the table with the numbers spread out before them, Tom Wheeler realized something profound. He wasn't fighting alone anymore. The mail came on a Thursday. Late October in Wyoming doesn't feel like autumn. It feels like a threat. The wind strips the last of the leaves off the cottonwoods. The sky turns a pale, bruised gray. You can smell the snow coming long before you see it. Tom rode into Red Fork for supplies, mostly flour, some coffee. He tied his horse outside the general store and stepped inside. Mrs. Crow was behind the counter. She was sorting a stack of envelopes. She looked up when the bell above the door rang. Her eyes darted from Tom to the letters in her hand and back to Tom. She had that look. The look of a woman who just found a loaded gun and was trying to figure out how to fire it. "Morning, Thomas," she said. Her voice was too bright, too eager. "Mrs. Crow," Tom nodded. He set his empty burlap sacks on the counter. She reached under the counter and pulled out 2 pieces of mail. She slid them across the worn wood. "Got the stage delivery this morning," she said. "One for you. Cattle registry, looks like." She tapped the second envelope. It was thick paper. Expensive. "And one for your cousin." Tom looked at the envelope. It was addressed in dark, sweeping ink. Sarah Wheeler. Care of Thomas Wheeler. Red Fork, Wyoming Territory. Mrs. Crow leaned over the counter. "Seems your cousin has family back east who know exactly how to find her. Strange, since you said she didn't have anyone left in Ohio." Tom picked up the letters. He didn't blink. He didn't let his jaw tighten. "She rode home to an old neighbor," Tom said flatly. "Let them know she arrived safe. People worry." Mrs. Crow smiled. It was a thin, unsatisfied smile. "Ah, of course." Tom bought his flour. He didn't rush. Rushing looks like guilt. He loaded the horse, swung up into the saddle, and rode out. But the moment the town was out of sight, he kicked the horse into a hard gallop. He knew Sarah hadn't written to anyone. She couldn't. When he reached the cabin, he walked straight in. He didn't take off his coat. He walked to the table, pulled the thick envelope from his pocket, and set it down. Sarah looked at it. She recognized the handwriting immediately. It was James, her younger brother. She didn't reach for it right away. She stood by the stove, staring at that piece of heavy paper like it was a trap waiting to snap shut. "Is it from the man you ran from?" Tom asked. His voice was low. He was already calculating how long it would take to pack the wagon. "No," Sarah whispered. "It's my brother." She walked over, picked it up. The wax seal broke with a sharp little crack. She unfolded the thick pages. She read. Tom watched her face. He saw her eyes scan the lines. He saw her breath hitch, just once. Then her face went completely blank. That schoolteacher mask slipped right back on. She set the letter down. "My father is dead," she said. The words just hung there in the cold cabin. Heart failure, she continued. Her voice was hollow. Happened 3 weeks ago. My mother has taken to her bed. The doctors say she won't last the winter. Tom took his hat off. I'm sorry, Ellie. Don't be, she said. It was sharp, bitter. He was a man who tried to sell his daughter to pay for his own bad bets. I won't mourn him. She looked back at the letter. But that's not why James wrote. She touched the paper. When the lawyers went through my father's study, they found something. A locked case. It belonged to my grandmother. She was a Quaker, stubborn, fierce. She died when I was 9. She left this case for me, to be given on my 21st birthday. My father hid it for 7 years. Sarah looked up at Tom. The lawyers say it is sealed. Only I can open it. They give it 30 days before it goes to the estate. James says I need to come back. And Hayes? Tom asked. The man she ran from. The man who held the debt. Disgraced, Sarah said. There was a hard edge of satisfaction in her tone. Caught in a public scandal with a politician's daughter. He's ruined, fled to New York. The debt is void. She stepped away from the table, walked to the window, looked out at the dead yellow grass. I could go back, she whispered. She wasn't talking to Tom, she was talking to the wind. Hayes is gone. The charges from the Elk Creek stagecoach. If I went to Boston, I could hire a real lawyer, a city lawyer. I could turn myself in on my own terms, prove it was self-defense. I have the money waiting in that locked case. Tom stood entirely still. He heard the words. He felt them hit his chest like a hammer. She was free. The cage was open. She didn't need to hide in a dirt floor cabin in Wyoming anymore. Are you going? He asked. He didn't want to ask it, but he had to. Sarah turned around. She looked at him, really looked at him, at the dirt on his coat, the lines around his eyes, the steady, unmovable strength of the man who had opened his door to a blood-soaked stranger. Do you want me to go? She asked. Tom didn't answer right away. He walked over to the back door, opened it. The cold air rushed in. He stepped out onto the porch. Sarah followed him. They stood side by side in the freezing wind, looking out over the land. I could ask you to stay, Tom said. His voice was rough, grating. I could tell you that I need you here, that the ranch needs you. I could tell you that I've slept better in the last 3 weeks than I have in 3 years. He gripped the wooden porch rail. His knuckles went white. But you didn't come here for me, Ellie. You came here because you were running for your life. And everything good that has happened since you walked through that door, you built it yourself. While I just stood beside you. He finally turned to her. That is not enough for me to hold you here. If you want to go to Boston, I will hitch the wagon right now. I will take you to the train station in Cheyenne. I will pay for your ticket. Sarah looked at him. And if I asked you what you wanted? I'd say I want you to stay, Tom said. The honesty in his eyes was absolute, devastating. And I'd say that asking for it would be the most selfish thing I've ever done. So I won't ask. He walked back inside. Left her standing on the porch. That night, they didn't speak. Tom slept in his chair. Sarah slept in the cot. But before the sun came up, she was sitting at the table, the oil lamp casting a warm circle of light. She was writing. When Tom woke, the smell of coffee was already in the air. Sarah walked over to him. She held out a piece of paper. This is for James, she said. I want you to mail it the next time you go to town, but I want you to read it first. Tom took the paper. He read, Dear James, I will not come to Boston. Whatever grandmother left in that case, I want it transferred to a trust for you, for your education, for any daughter you might one day have. I have what I need. I have a home. I have a partner in this life who asks nothing of me and gives everything. I will not return. Wyoming is where I will live, and it is where I will be buried. Come visit when you finish your schooling. Your sister, Ellie. Tom read it twice. His hands felt heavy. He looked at the bottom of the page. "You didn't sign your last name," Tom said. Sarah looked at him. "Because I want you to tell me before I sign it if Wheeler is a name I'm allowed to use. Not as a borrowed cousin, not as a ghost of your past, as mine." Tom stood up. He walked to the table. He picked up the pencil she had left there. He leaned over her letter, and on the blank line at the bottom he wrote Thomas Wheeler, husband. He set the pencil down, stepped back. Sarah looked at his signature. A slow, warm smile touched her face. She picked up the pencil, and right above his name she wrote, Sarah Ellen Wheeler. It wasn't a church wedding. There was no preacher, no ring. Just two names on a piece of paper going back east. But in a cabin out on the Wyoming plains, it was the only vow that mattered. The peace lasted exactly 3 days. It was October 31st. The ground was hard as iron. Tom was out by the barn chopping firewood. The axe fell in a steady, rhythmic thud. It was the only sound for miles, until the hoofbeats started, fast, desperate, tearing up the frost on the trail. Tom dropped the axe. He turned toward the house, his hand already reaching for the rifle leaning against the porch rail. But the rider wasn't an outlaw. It was Jed Parker. Jed didn't even slow his horse to a trot. He hauled back on the reins right in the yard. The horse danced, blowing steam from its nostrils. "Tom," Jed barked. He was out of breath. "Federal marshal came in on last night's stagecoach." Tom froze. Sarah stepped out onto the porch. She was wiping her hands on an apron. She heard. "Name is Bo Calloway," Jed continued. His eyes darted between Tom and Sarah. "He took a room at the hotel. Silas Marsh was waiting for him in the lobby this morning. They had breakfast together. Marsh did all the talking." "How long do we have?" Tom asked. His voice was dead calm. "Till afternoon, at the latest. Calloway isn't a man who wastes daylight." Jed looked at Sarah. He tipped his hat just slightly. "Ma'am, whatever you did out there on the trail, I don't need to know. But I served with Bo Calloway before the war. He's a hard man, but he's honest. He won't beat a confession out of you, but he will put you in irons if Silas Marsh gives him the rope to do it. You've got one chance. You talk to Calloway before Silas finishes painting his picture." "Why are you doing this, Mr. Parker?" Sarah asked. "You're risking your own neck coming out here." Jed spat into the dirt. "I already told your husband why." He spurred his horse, rode out as fast as he came. Silence fell over the yard again. But it wasn't a peaceful silence anymore. It was the silence before a firing squad. Tom walked up the porch steps. He didn't stop. He walked straight into the cabin. He pulled the heavy trunk from under the bed, flipped the latches. "We're leaving," Tom said. He started pulling out clothes, blankets. "Briar is my fastest horse. We saddle him, we saddle the mare. We leave the herd. We can make the Idaho border in 3 days if we ride through the night. I've got enough gold buried under the floorboards to buy a piece of land in Oregon. We start over." Sarah didn't move. She just watched him tear his own life apart. "Would you really do that?" she asked. "Leave this ranch? Leave your land?" Tom stopped. He held a wool blanket in his hands. He looked up at her. "In a heartbeat," he said. "It's just dirt, Ellie. It's not my wife. You're my wife." Sarah felt the tears sting the back of her eyes. It was the first time he had said the word out loud. Wife. She walked over to him. She put her hands over his. She pressed the blanket down. "No," she said. Tom stared at her. "Ellie, if that marshal—" "I have run my entire life," Sarah interrupted. Her voice was quiet, but it was made of steel. "I ran from my father. I ran from Hayes. I ran from the men on the trail. If I run again, I will just prove to myself that I was right to be afraid. And I am done being afraid." She let go of his hands. "I am going to sit at that table. I am going to look Marshal Calloway in the eye. And I am going to tell him the exact truth. I have to know if the truth matters out here. If it doesn't, then Oregon won't be far enough anyway." Tom looked at her for a long time. He saw the fire in her, the absolute refusal to break. He slowly let the blanket fall back into the trunk. "All right," Tom said. "Then that's what we do." It was mid-afternoon when the riders came. 2 of them. Tom was waiting on the porch. He had his gun belt off. It was laying on the small wooden table next to his chair, in plain sight. No sudden moves. The riders slowed their horses to a walk. The man in the lead was tall, broad shoulders, a thick salt and pepper beard. His eyes were the color of faded denim, and they missed absolutely nothing. Marshal Bo Calloway. The younger man riding behind him was a deputy, hand resting nervously on his thigh. Calloway pulled back on his reins. He didn't dismount right away. He looked at Tom. He looked at the gun on the table. "Thomas Wheeler?" Calloway asked. His voice was a deep rumble. "Yes, sir. I'm investigating the robbery and murders on the Elk Creek stage, October 18th. I have reason to believe you might have information. Is your wife in the house?" Tom stood his ground. "She is. I'd like to speak with her. And you." "Come inside," Tom said. Calloway swung down from his horse. His boots hit the dirt with a heavy, authoritative thud. He told his deputy to wait by the horses. He followed Tom inside. The cabin was warm. The table was clear. Sarah was sitting in a straight-backed chair. She didn't stand up when the marshal entered. She sat tall, hands folded in her lap. In front of her on the table was the wedding dress. It was folded neatly. She had scrubbed it as best she could, but the dark, rust-colored stains were still heavily visible on the white cotton. Next to the dress was a piece of paper, covered in neat, precise handwriting. Calloway stopped at the edge of the table. He looked at the bloody dress. "Marshal Calloway," Sarah said. Her voice didn't shake. "My name is Sarah Ellen Wheeler. I am the passenger your report lists as missing from the Laramie stagecoach." Calloway's eyes shifted from the dress to her face. He didn't speak. "Before you ask me your questions," Sarah continued, "I would ask that you read this." She nudged the paper forward. "It is my sworn statement, written without coercion. I will swear to every word of it in any federal court you choose." Calloway looked at her. He pulled out a chair. He sat down. He picked up the paper. The silence in the cabin was suffocating. Tom stood by the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He watched Calloway's eyes move back and forth across the page. It took him 5 minutes to read it. 5 minutes that felt like 5 years. Calloway reached the bottom of the page. He didn't say anything. He went back to the top. He read it again. Finally, he set the paper face down on the table. He let out a slow breath. "Mrs. Wheeler," Calloway said. Tom tensed. "The boy you killed," Calloway said, his voice flat. "His name was Nathaniel Kruger. He was 21 years old, wanted in 3 territories for armed robbery and worse." Sarah held her breath. "His older brother," Calloway continued, "Otto Kruger. He was arrested in a saloon in Deadwood 4 days ago. He got drunk. He got loud. He started complaining about a woman in a wedding dress who gutted his little brother like a fish." Sarah exhaled. It was a shaky, ragged sound. "We interrogated him," Calloway said. "His confession corroborates your statement, almost word for word." "Then why are you here?" Tom asked, stepping away from the door. Calloway turned in his chair. "Because a banker named Silas Marsh sat me down this morning, told me a very different story. He told me you were a runaway from Boston, using a false name. He suggested you were likely involved in the robbery yourself. He even offered to draw up papers to seize this land, assuming I'd be taking you both away in irons." Tom's blood ran cold. Calloway stood up. He looked at Tom. "I've worn this badge for 23 years, Mr. Wheeler. I know what a liar sounds like, and I know what the truth looks like when it's written down." Calloway reached across the table. He held out his hand to Sarah. She looked at it. Then she reached out and shook it. His grip was firm, respectful. "On behalf of the United States Marshal Service," Calloway said softly, "I apologize for what happened to you on that road. You defended yourself against an animal. You are not a suspect. You are a witness. Otto Kruger will hang because of your statement." Sarah pulled her hand back. The relief washing over her was so heavy she felt like she might collapse. Calloway picked up his hat. He walked toward the door. He stopped next to Tom. "Mr. Wheeler?" "Marshal." "It's not my jurisdiction," Calloway said, his voice dropping low. "But a man who will lie to a federal marshal just to steal his neighbor's land, that is a man who will burn your house down with you inside it." Calloway put his hat on. "I suggest you get your business with Silas Marsh settled. Quickly." He walked out the door. The heavy thud of his boots faded across the porch. Tom looked at Sarah. They had won the battle. But the marshal was right. Silas Marsh was still out there, and cornered rats are the ones that bite the hardest. November 1st came with a hard frost, the kind of cold that snaps the grass under your boots. Tom didn't hitch the wagon that morning. He saddled the horses. He and Sarah rode into Red Fork. They didn't go alone. Harold Bishop rode with them. He was a lawyer from Cheyenne. Sarah had written to him back when she first ran the numbers on Silas Marsh's ledgers. Bishop had arrived on the late stage the night before. He wore a gray suit, carried a leather briefcase. He didn't look like a man who belonged on the frontier. He looked like a man who knew how to ruin you on paper. They walked into the bank. The brass bell jingled. Silas Marsh was sitting behind his heavy oak desk. He looked up. The smug, polished smile was already forming on his face. He thought Tom was coming to beg, or to hand over the deed to the south pasture. Then Silas saw Bishop, and the smile died. Tom didn't say a word. He stood back. He let Sarah step forward. She walked up to the edge of the desk. She placed an envelope on the polished wood. "Mr. Marsh," Sarah said. Her voice was steady, cold. "My husband is here to make his winter payment." Silas blinked. He looked at the envelope. "That is unexpected. I assumed we were discussing a land transfer." Harold Bishop stepped up next to Sarah. He opened his briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of papers and slapped them down on the desk. "Mr. Marsh," Bishop said. His voice was clipped, professional. "My client, Mr. Wheeler, is tendering his November payment of $612. This amount is calculated according to the original promissory note signed in 1877, at the agreed rate of 6% simple interest." Silas's face lost its color. He reached for the papers. "Furthermore," Bishop continued, not letting Silas speak, "I am filing a civil claim in federal court this afternoon, on behalf of Mr. Wheeler, for the restitution of $980, the exact amount you have overcharged him through fraudulent compound interest over the past 3 years." Silas opened his mouth, closed it. He looked like a fish pulled out of the creek. "I have already sent a wire to the U.S. Marshal in Cheyenne regarding these findings," Bishop added. It was a lie, but it was a beautiful one. "If you wish to settle this privately, we will accept the $980 in restitution today, and drop the complaint. If you contest it, we will see you in federal court, where your banking license will likely be revoked." The bank was dead quiet. The teller in the corner had stopped counting coins. Silas looked at Tom. He looked at Sarah. He looked at the math on the papers. He knew he was beaten. "I will settle," Silas hissed. His voice was venomous. "Wise," Bishop said. He didn't blink. They walked out of the bank 20 minutes later. The debt was clear. They had cash in their pockets. The land was theirs. They rode home in silence. It was a good silence, a victorious one. But victories out here don't usually last through the night. They went to sleep early, exhausted from the tension. The cabin was dark. The fire in the stove burned down to a dull orange glow. At 2 in the morning, Tom woke up. It wasn't a sound that woke him. It was a smell, acrid, sharp, smoke. Then the sound hit him. Briar, his fastest horse, was screaming in the barn. A high, terrified whinny that tore through the night. Tom threw the blankets off. "Ellie, get up!" He didn't bother with his boots. He ran out the door in his stocking feet. The night sky wasn't dark. It was glowing, orange and angry. The barn was on fire. The flames were already licking up the dry wooden siding, reaching for the hayloft. The wind was whipping hard from the north, blowing the sparks straight toward the main cabin. "Buckets!" Tom roared over the roar of the fire. "Get to the well!" Sarah was already running. She pumped the iron handle of the well. The water splashed into the wooden buckets, heavy, freezing. Tom grabbed a heavy wool blanket, dunked it into the horse trough. He sprinted toward the barn, throwing the wet wool over the flames, trying to beat them back. It was like spitting on the devil. The heat was massive. It pushed the air out of his lungs. Sarah ran up beside him, hurling a bucket of water against the burning wall. It hissed into steam instantly. "Tom!" Sarah screamed. She pointed out into the dark. "Look!" At the edge of the north pasture, sitting on horseback just beyond the ring of light, were two men. They weren't moving. They were just watching the fire burn. "Let them go!" Tom yelled back. "Save the house! Keep the roof wet!" He ran to the barn doors. He kicked the latch free. He slapped Briar hard on the rump. The horse bolted out into the night, away from the flames. The other horses followed. They fought the fire for 10 minutes, just the two of them. It was a losing battle. The sparks caught the roof of the smokehouse. Now they had two fires. Tom was hauling another bucket from the well when he heard the crack. A heavy support beam on the barn roof snapped. Sarah was standing too close, throwing water. "Ellie, move!" Tom screamed. She turned, but not fast enough. The burning timber crashed down. A thick, flaming splinter struck her right shoulder. It knocked her to the dirt. She cried out, grabbing her arm. Tom dropped the bucket. He ran into the heat. He grabbed her under the arms and dragged her back, away from the fire, over to the well. "Stay down!" Tom gasped. His face was black with soot. "Don't move." He looked back at the fire. The barn was gone. The smokehouse was going. The wind was pushing a shower of sparks onto the roof of the cabin. Tom stood there, alone in the heat. He didn't have enough hands. He couldn't save it. He was going to watch everything he had burned to the ground. Then he heard it. Hoofbeats. Not two horses. A dozen. Coming fast from the south trail. Jed Parker came out of the dark first. He didn't even stop his horse. He vaulted off the saddle while the animal was still moving. He had two buckets in his hands. Right behind him came Reverend Bell. Then the two grown sons of Mrs. Crow. Then Emma Rhea's father. Then 3 other neighbors Tom hadn't spoken to in 3 years. They didn't ask questions. They didn't stand around. They formed a line from the creek to the cabin, handing heavy, sloshing buckets up the line. Jed was on the roof of the cabin, stomping out sparks with his heavy boots, pouring water down the shingles. They fought the devil together. It took 2 hours. When the sun finally began to bleed over the horizon, the fire was dead. The barn was a pile of smoking black ash. Half the smokehouse was gone, but the main cabin stood untouched. The horses were safe in the pasture. Tom stood in the middle of the yard. His lungs burned. His hands were blistered. He looked around. 7 men, covered in soot and mud, leaning on their knees, catching their breath. Sarah was sitting by the well. Jed Parker had torn a strip from his own shirt to bandage her burned shoulder. Reverend Bell walked over to Tom. His face was smeared with ash. He didn't speak for a long time. He just looked at the ruined barn. "Thomas," the Reverend finally said. His voice was raspy from the smoke. "I stopped coming to your door last fall. I thought you wanted to be left alone. I thought I was respecting your grief." Bell shook his head. "I was wrong. I should have kept knocking. A man shouldn't be left alone out here. I'm sorry." Tom swallowed hard. "Reverend, you don't have to." "Let me finish," Bell said. He put a heavy, soot-stained hand on Tom's shoulder. "You have a community here, Tom. You always did. We just let you forget it. We won't let you forget it again." Cobb, the town blacksmith, walked up. He was holding something in his massive, dirt-caked hand. He had walked out to the edge of the north pasture, where the 2 riders had sat watching the flames. "Reverend," Cobb said. He held out a piece of white fabric. It was a linen handkerchief, dropped in the tall grass. Embroidered in the corner with dark silk thread were 2 letters. S.M. "I think we all know whose initials these are," Cobb grunted. Reverend Bell took the handkerchief. He folded it carefully. He slipped it into his coat pocket. His eyes were hard. "I think," Reverend Bell said, "it is time for the town of Red Fork to have a conversation with Mr. Silas Marsh. and I do not think it is a conversation for the sheriff. Reverend, Tom stepped forward. I don't want vengeance, no blood. No one is speaking of vengeance, Thomas, Bell said. His voice echoed across the quiet, smoking yard. We are speaking of consequence. There is a difference. A Christian community must know which is which. Bell looked toward town. Mr. Marsh will leave Red Fork today. He will sell his share of the bank to his partners. He will pack a single bag. He will get on the eastbound stagecoach. And he will never set foot in Wyoming territory again. That is the consequence. It is not vengeance. Jed Parker spit into the ash. And if he refuses to leave? Then he will face the U.S. Marshal for arson and attempted murder, Bell said. He pointed to Sarah, sitting by the well. Mrs. Wheeler's shoulder is the evidence. This handkerchief is the evidence. We are all witnesses. He will choose the consequence he prefers. The men murmured their agreement. They turned toward their horses. Tom stood there. He looked at his ruined barn. He looked at his wife, wounded but breathing, and he looked at his neighbors mounting up to fight his battle for him. For the first time in 3 years, the hollow ache in his chest was gone. The loneliness was broken. He walked over to the well. He knelt down in the dirt next to Sarah. He didn't hug her. He just leaned forward and rested his forehead against hers. He closed his eyes, smelled the smoke in her hair. We're staying, Tom whispered. Sarah rested her good hand against his soot-stained cheek. I know, she said. They never knew exactly what was said in that room. 3 days after the fire, Reverend Bell, Jed Parker, and the lawyer, Harold Bishop, walked into the Red Fork Bank. They closed the heavy oak doors behind them, pulled the shades. They were in there for 40 minutes. When they came out, Silas Marsh looked like a ghost. He didn't speak to anyone. He went to his boarding house. He packed one leather valise. The next morning, before the sun was fully up, Silas climbed aboard the eastbound stage. He didn't look out the window. He didn't wave goodbye. He just vanished into the dust, exiled by the people he thought he owned. Tom and Sarah weren't at the stage station to watch him go. They were at the ranch, clearing the charred wood of the barn, making room for what came next. 2 weeks later, Sunday, November 13th. The Red Fork Church was packed, 50 people crammed into the wooden pews. It was nearly the entire population of the town. Tom stood at the front. He wore a clean suit he'd bought in Cheyenne. Jed Parker stood next to him as his best man, a quiet, steady presence. The pump organ groaned out a hymn. The heavy doors opened. Sarah didn't wear a wedding dress. The white cotton dress, the one soaked in the blood of the boy she killed, was gone. She had thrown it into the cabin stove 3 nights ago. She watched it burn until it was nothing but gray ash. Not out of hatred, but because she decided she didn't need to carry that memory in the fabric of her life anymore. She wore the blue dress, the one Emma Reyes and her mother had tailored perfectly to fit her, a gift from the town. She walked down the aisle. Emma walked behind her as her maid of honor. Reverend Bell stood at the altar. He smiled down at them. We don't need the standard vows today, Bell said to the congregation. These two have already survived enough to prove their intentions. They wrote their own. He nodded to Tom. Tom turned to Sarah. He took her hands. His hands were rough. Hers were calloused. They fit together perfectly. Sarah Ellen, Tom said. His voice was thick, but it didn't shake. I met you on a Tuesday. You walked out of a wagon in a dress you hated. I didn't want a wife. I didn't want a guest. I just wanted to be left alone in my grief. He took a slow breath. The church was dead silent. You didn't give me what I wanted. You gave me what I needed. You gave me someone who refused to pretend the world wasn't broken. I promise you my land, what's left of it. I promise you my name, whatever it's worth. I promise that when I grow old, the last thing I'll forget is the first time you laughed in my kitchen. I promise to stand beside you, not in front of you. And I promise that when something burns down, we will rebuild it together. Mrs. Crow was crying in the second row. Sarah looked up at him. Her eyes were bright, fierce. Thomas Wheeler, she said. I came to Wyoming running from a man. I stayed in Wyoming because of a man. Those are not the same thing. They could not be more different. She squeezed his hands. You asked me for nothing. That is how I knew I could give you everything. I was not a bride when I arrived. I was a survivor. You let me be both, and neither, and something entirely new. I promised to bring my whole self to this marriage, my anger, my brains, my stubbornness, and what's left of my tenderness. I promised to fight next to you when fighting is needed, and to be still next to you when the day requires stillness. And I promise that wherever we are buried, we will be buried side by side, because the story we are starting today is too good to have a different ending. Reverend Bell wiped his eye. I pronounce you husband and wife. Jed Parker reached out and shook Tom's hand. Brother, Jed said. That was all. It was enough. A week after the wedding, the winter snow finally hit. It came down thick and heavy, burying the scorched earth of the yard in a pure, blinding white. It was late. Sarah was asleep in the loft. Tom sat at the table downstairs. The oil lamp flickered. He had a piece of paper in front of him, a pen in his hand. He was writing a letter. Not to send, to burn. Carolyn, I'm writing this 3 years late. I should have said these things when you were dying. But I was too angry at God to be gentle. I'm sorry. I was a bad husband at the end because I couldn't stand the thought of losing you. Tom stopped, dipped the pen. I sat at your grave for a month drinking myself blind. I tried to follow you. But then I realized Mary would have been furious with me for giving up. So I kept living. Just barely. Until October. He looked toward the stairs, listening to the soft rhythm of Sarah's breathing. I didn't replace you. No one could ever replace you. Sarah is not my second wife in the way people usually mean it. She is my first wife in a second life. The life you and I built ended in '78. This is a different life. I love her differently than I loved you. Both are real. I think you'd understand that. I think you'd like her. She isn't standing in your place. She's standing in her own. Tom signed his name. He didn't read it twice. He folded it, walked over to the stove, opened the iron door, and tossed the paper into the flames. He watched it curl, turn black, and ride the heat up the chimney. Out into the Wyoming night. He felt a hand on his back. Sarah stood behind him. She hadn't asked who the letter was for. She didn't need to. She stepped up beside him and slipped her hand into his. They watched the fire together. Spring came hard and fast in 1882. The snow melted, the mud thickened, and the ground softened just enough to dig. Sarah had ordered something from a nursery in Missouri. It arrived on the train in Cheyenne. Tom took the wagon to pick it up. 20 apple saplings. They didn't plant them by the house. They didn't plant them down by the creek. Sarah took the shovel and walked to the exact spot where the barn had burned down. The ground was still black with soot and ash. Jed Parker rode over to help. They dug the holes. They planted the young trees in a neat straight line across the scar on the land. Reverend Bell rode out that afternoon. He sat on his horse, watching them pack the dirt around the fragile roots. Apple trees, Mrs. Wheeler? Bell asked, smiling. Right on the site of the fire? Yes, Reverend, Sarah said, leaning on her shovel. She wiped the sweat from her forehead. You know it will take 7 years before they bear a single piece of fruit. I know, Sarah said. And you know the ashes from the fire make the soil richer. That's exactly why I chose this spot. Bell dismounted. He walked over to her. He looked at the frail little trees standing against the vast, empty plains. There is an old teaching, Mrs. Wheeler, Bell said quietly. His voice carried the weight of a man who had seen too much war and too much pain. I have preached it for 40 years, but I think I only just finally understood it. Sarah looked at him. We do not forgive people in order to forget what they did to us, Bell said. We forgive them so that our hands are free to plant what comes next. Unforgiveness is not a sword, Sarah. It is a burden. And while you are carrying it, you cannot hold a shovel. You have chosen to plant. I believe God sees you. Sarah looked down at the black dirt on her hands. I haven't forgiven that boy on the trail, Reverend, she whispered. I don't think he requires your forgiveness, Bell said gently. He requires only that you do not let what he did make you less than you were. That isn't forgiveness. That's freedom, and you've already found it." Bell tipped his hat. He climbed back on his horse and rode away. Sarah stood in the dirt. The wind blew through her hair. It smelled like wet earth and pine. Tom walked up beside her. He looked at the row of 20 trees. "Think they'll make it through the winter?" Tom asked. Sarah looked at her husband, at his calloused hands, at the steady, unwavering truth in his eyes. "They'll make it," Sarah said. "They have deep roots. 7 years. That is how long it takes an apple tree to bear fruit from a sapling. You plant it in the ash, you water it, you wait. You fight off the frost. You fight off the drought. And you wait." September 1888. Sarah was 33. Tom was 41. The ranch didn't look like it used to. The barn was rebuilt. Bigger this time, heavy timber. The smokehouse was running full tilt. They had 80 head of cattle grazing in the south pasture, 4 good horses, and they had a daughter, Mary Ellen Wheeler. 5 years old, hair the color of pale wheat, just like Caroline's used to be. Sarah picked the name. Tom didn't ask her to. She just looked at him the day the girl was born and said, "This house had a Mary once." It's time her name was said out loud again. Jed Parker still lived to the east. He was grayer now, moving a little slower, but he still rode over every Sunday for dinner. Reverend Bell was gone. He passed away in his sleep the winter before. 75 years old. The town named the street running past the church after him. Red Fork was growing. It had a real schoolhouse now, a new preacher. Things change. But the biggest change was the orchard. 20 trees, standing in a neat straight line right where the old barn had burned. And for the first time their branches were heavy. Bright red apples pulling the wood toward the earth. That was the month the stagecoach brought visitors. James Whitcomb, Sarah's younger brother, 26 years old now, a Harvard graduate, a lawyer in Boston. He brought his wife, Elizabeth, and their 2-year-old boy. Tom and Sarah met them at the station in Cheyenne. It had been 7 years. There was no crying, no dramatic falling to the dirt. Just a long, quiet embrace between a brother and a sister who had both survived their father in different ways. They brought them back to the ranch. After dinner, the sun started to dip low, turning the Wyoming sky into a bruised purple. James and Sarah walked out to the orchard. Elizabeth stayed in the house with Tom and the children. James reached up, picked an apple. He polished it on his fine wool vest. "You built something, Ellie," James said. "We built something," Sarah corrected him. James smiled. "Mother would have liked to see this." "I think she sees it," Sarah said softly. "Grandmother, too." James stopped walking. He looked down at the apple. Then he reached into his coat pocket. "I brought you something," James said. "I wasn't sure if I should, but it's yours." He pulled out a heavy canvas pouch. He handed it to her. It jingled. "I opened Grandmother's locked case," James said. "I had to. It sat in an attorney's office for 6 years. Inside was a letter, and $4,700 in gold coins." Sarah stared at the pouch in her hands. It was heavy. "I have the letter," James said. He pulled a folded piece of parchment from his breast pocket. "I'll read it to you. To my granddaughter, Sarah Ellen. Thy mother married a man I never trusted. I could not stop it. I could only save what I could for thee. This gold is from my own dowry. I kept it in my own name despite thy grandfather's wishes. I leave it to thee on one condition, that thou usest it to live a life no man has chosen for thee. Choose, child, thy grandmother Patience." James folded the letter. "I put the gold in a trust for you in Cheyenne," James said quietly. "I didn't know if you wanted it. But she saw what was coming, Ellie. 16 years before you needed it. She tried to buy your way out." Sarah looked at the trees, the red fruit glowing in the dusk. She held the pouch out, handed it back to James. "I want you to draw up the papers," Sarah said. Her voice was absolute. "For what?" "I want every cent of it given to the new school in Red Fork, anonymously. Set up a scholarship fund for the girls. Name it for Grandmother Patience." James stared at her. Ellie, that's a lot of money. I don't need it, Sarah said. She smiled. It was a real deep smile. I already have what she wanted me to have. I have a life no man chose for me. James looked at his sister. He nodded. He put the gold back in his pocket. 2 weeks later, the visit was over. The wagon was loaded. James and Elizabeth were saying their goodbyes on the porch. Tom walked down the steps. He handed James a thick envelope. "What's this?" James asked. "It's for your mother-in-law," Tom said. "Or for any daughter you might have one day. Or maybe just keep it in your law office. Give it to a woman who comes in looking for help. Don't open it unless there's a reason." James looked at the unmarked envelope. He tucked it into his coat. After the wagon rolled out of sight, disappearing down the long dirt road, Sarah stood next to Tom on the porch. "What was in the envelope?" she asked. "A letter," Tom said. "For who?" "For any woman who might someday arrive at a strange door in a dress she didn't want to wear." Tom put his hands in his pockets. "I wrote it last winter. I didn't know what to do with it. Figured maybe James could put it somewhere it might do some good." Sarah looked at him. "Do you have a copy?" Tom nodded. He pulled the folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket. He handed it to her. Sarah opened it. She stood on the porch, the Wyoming wind pulling at her hair, and she read the words her husband had written in the dark. "To whoever finds this letter, I do not know your name. I do not know what brought you to the door where someone handed you this paper. I don't know if you came by choice or by accident. I don't know if your dress is clean or if it's stained. But I know this, because my wife taught it to me. You are not what was done to you. You are not the worst thing that happened on the road here. You are not your father's debt. You are not your husband's bruise. You are not the ghost of the woman they told you to be. You are the person standing in the doorway right now, choosing what to do next. The world will try to tell you that you owe it an explanation for your survival. You do not. The world will try to tell you that forgiveness is your responsibility. It is not. Forgiveness is a gift you give yourself when your hands get tired of carrying the anger. Give it when you are ready, not a second before. Find one person who opens a door for you without asking why. Just one. It is enough. It is the whole world. And if no one opens a door for you, then someday, when you have a door of your own, open it for someone else. That is how the chain continues. That is how we survive. You are not alone. You were never the mistake. Thomas Wheeler, Red Fork, Wyoming. At the very bottom, in smaller print, he had added, "For my wife, Sarah, who arrived in a dress she hated and became the bravest person I have ever known." Sarah finished reading. She carefully folded the paper. She didn't wipe the tears from her face. She just looked at Tom. "Send it," Sarah whispered. "You think?" "Don't wait for James to hand it out," she said. "Give it to Reverend Hughes. Have him print it in the church bulletin. Send it to the newspaper in Cheyenne. Send it back east. There are 1,000 women out there who need to read that right now, tonight." Tom looked at the letter. He nodded. "All right." Thomas Wheeler did send the letter. It was printed in the Red Fork Church Bulletin in October 1888. The Cheyenne Leader picked it up a week later. Then the Boston Advertiser, where James Whitcomb made sure it ran on the front page. It was reprinted in 17 newspapers across the United States over the next 2 years. Women wrote back. Some of them packed their bags and came west. Some of them found their own doors to open exactly where they were. Some of them just folded the clipping and kept it tucked inside their Bibles for the rest of their lives. Sarah Ellen Wheeler lived on that ranch until 1931. She died at the age of 76, in the same bed where her daughter had been born. She was buried on the gentle rise beneath the old cottonwood tree. She was laid right next to Thomas Wheeler, who had gone ahead of her 4 years prior. Just a few feet away rested 2 small stones bearing the names Caroline and Mary, all of them in the same earth, all of them together. The apple orchard she planted in the ashes still bears fruit today. Some love stories begin with a polite meeting. Some begin with a sweet letter. Theirs began with a stagecoach stopping in the wrong town, a wedding dress soaked in blood that wasn't hers, and a door that opened anyway. And somewhere out there, for someone who needs it, that door is still opening. That is the whole point.
All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. The author bears no intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality. Out here, in the wide, unforgiving lands of the West, people often believe that survival is the greatest victory a person can claim. But this story reminds us that survival alone is not enough. Tom and Sarah didn't just survive, they chose how to live afterward. And that choice, more than anything else, is what defines the true strength of a person. What we've witnessed is not simply a tale of danger or loss or even justice. It is a story about what happens when two wounded souls refuse to let the past turn them into something cold and unrecognizable. Sarah could have remained a victim of her circumstances, forever running, forever looking over her shoulder. Tom could have stayed buried in his grief, locked away from the world and from any chance at healing. But instead, they did something far more difficult. They opened the door, not just to each other, but to trust, to honesty, and to the possibility of something better. The West, in all its harshness, strips people down to who they really are. There are no masks that last long out there, no easy lies, and that is where the true lesson of this story lies. Character is revealed not when life is easy, but when everything is at stake. Sarah chose to tell the truth, even when it could have cost her freedom. Tom chose to stand beside her, even when it could have cost him everything he had left. And in doing so, they proved that courage is not always loud or heroic. It is often quiet, steady, and deeply personal. Another truth this story offers is that justice and compassion are not opposites. Too often, people believe that to be strong, you must be hard, that to survive, you must lose your sense of mercy. But what we see here is the opposite. Sarah defended herself when she had no other choice, yet she still carried the weight of that act. Tom, a man broken by loss, found it within himself to trust again, not blindly, but honestly. And in the end, it wasn't revenge that brought resolution. It was truth, community, and the willingness of others to stand up for what was right. Perhaps the most powerful meaning behind this story is the idea that healing does not come from forgetting the past, but from building something new in spite of it. The burned barn, the scars they carry, the memories they cannot erase, none of these disappear. But instead of letting those things define their future, they choose to plant something in their place. Something that will take time. Something that will grow slowly. Something that will outlast the pain that came before it. And maybe that's the lesson we carry with us. No matter how broken something seems, no matter how much has been lost, there is always the possibility of rebuilding. Not perfectly, not easily, but meaningfully. Because in the end, life is not measured by what we manage to escape, but by what we are brave enough to stay and build. If this story gave you something to think about, or something to feel, then its journey doesn't end here. It continues with you.